Okay. Welcome, everyone, to New York Writers Workshop, Bloomsday celebration. Happy Bloomsday. I'm Ravi Shankar. I'm here with Tim Tomlinson for a terrific conversation. Tim, you want to say some words?
Sure. Hello, everyone. So happy to be here with our distinguished panel. If you're hearing any kind of static, so are we. We're hoping that will alleviate as we go forward. So please bear with us. This is hosted by New York Writers Workshop. We are a not-for-profit organization dedicated to offering professional guidance, resources, and workshops that teach craft, foster creativity, and help writers of all levels, ages, races, creeds, orientations achieve their goals. I will introduce two of our guests, Michael Stevens and Emer Martin, say a little bit about them. And then I'm going to turn it over to Ravi, my co-host. And Ravi will introduce our other distinguished guests, and then we'll get into a discussion. So I'll start with introducing Michael Stevens. Rather than read Michael's lengthy bio with so many fantastic credits, I thought I would just hold up a couple of books that I think you all should be familiar with. Michael was doing things that didn't have names really until he did them and people started assigning categories. This is one of them, Lost in Soul. It's a memoir, where am I here? Lost in Soul and Other Discoveries on the Korean Peninsula. Fantastic memoir that was just written about a little while ago in the LA Times. Today, we'll probably refer a bit to this one, Green Dreams, a collection of essays under the influence of the Irish, in which Michael has an illuminating essay about his own experience with James Joyce. Michael is also a playwright. I guess the thing to say is, what isn't Michael? He's done just about everything you can, except maybe produce an album, but that could be coming up as well. There is another book coming out very soon in September called History of the Theater or the Glass of Fashion, a prose poem that'll come out in September. And maybe Michael will tell us a little bit more about that when he starts talking. Michael is also my teacher. I worked with Michael at Columbia University in an earlier century, and I owe so much to him. He was really the first validation I felt as a young writer. I take with me so much of what happened in the courses I had with Michael. And we have Emer Martin. I remember hearing about Emer back when I was teaching at the Writer's Voice, also in an earlier century. While I hadn't met her, I heard so much about this fantastic, wild writer from Ireland. And I think so much of what's developed in between then and now bears that out. Emer is a Dubliner who's lived in Paris, London, the Middle East, and various places in the U.S. The Cruelty Men is her most recent novel, published by the Lilliput Press, nominated for the Irish Novel of the Year in 2019. On our website, I've also linked to Emer's website. If you visit that, you'll see that she's also a phenomenal painter, and the painting as well has a kind of wildness and freshness to it. The prose, I think, is one of the references to the prose in the new novel is that it howls like a dog. I hope we hear some of that howling today. I want to introduce my dear friend and colleague, Ravi Shankar, who will introduce our other panelists, and then we'll get into Bloomsday.
Great. Thank you so much, Tim, and happy Bloomsday to everyone. It's my great pleasure to introduce a couple of Joyce scholars. One is Jim LeBlanc, holds a PhD in French literature from Cornell University in Ithaca. Jim has been reading and talking about Joyce's work for over 30 years and has published several essays on Joyce, primarily on Dubliners, Finnegan's Wake, and in addition to his scholarly work, Jim served as the director of the 2005 North American James Joyce Conference held at Cornell. And he also is a former board member of the International James Joyce Foundation. So it's a great pleasure. He's joining us from Ithaca, which is appropriate given the subject of our talk today. And I also feel exceedingly lucky to have the chance to introduce, I think, a living legend when it comes to Joyceans, Dr. Fritz Senn, who is speaking to us from Zurich. And he took an early interest in Joyce as an amateur scholar. He was lucky enough to be part of a very amiable Joyce community. And he published the Wake newsletter with Clive Hart and was involved with the inception of the very first International James Joyce Symposium in 1967. He's written extensively on Joyce, particularly on translation issues, and his approach is philological and textual, not theoretical. And I'm hoping we'll hear a little bit about that distinction. I don't know, Fritz, if you brought any of your books to show, but I know that you've published a number of books, including the one that I'm familiar with, Joycean Memoirs, which is a great little neologism in coinage. So thank you so much, Fritz, Michael, Emer, and Jim for all being here. And I thought we could kick off our conversation. It's almost hard, incredulous to believe that there was a moment where Ulysses was censored and considered pornographic. And, you know, thinking about its serialization, I guess I want to just begin with the relevance of Joyce today. I mean, he, in some respects, is still well lauded. In other respects, it feels like he's being read less and less. And perhaps you could each speak to your own encounter with Joyce. How did you encounter his work, and what effect did it have on your own life and academic careers? Fritz, Dr. Senn, do you want to begin? Not sure if you can hear us. Well, there might be a audio issue, but while we see if Fritz is with us, hopefully so, maybe somebody else wants to jump in. Michael?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for inviting me, and thanks for putting this together. And glad to meet all of you. And it's interesting. I'm 74 years old, and sometimes considered an Irish writer, sometimes considered an American writer. I've never been invited to anything to do with James Joyce in those 74 years. So either you're all getting flabby, or just maybe the world is caught up or something. But no, I've always been deeply involved in Joyce's work from a very young person. His biography is, well, his immediate upbringing, the poverty that he grew up in, that urban poverty of Dublin in his case, and Brooklyn and Long Island in my case. He had 9 brothers and sisters. His parents had a total of 15 or 16 children. 9 of them lived to adulthood. And that was the same numbers in my family. And maybe Emer can talk to this more, but in Irish families, you get assigned roles. And I was always assigned the more intellectual role in my fighting family. And also, I've often characterized myself as a white sheep living in a black sheep family. So my father, my mother, and all my siblings were black sheep. I was trying to be a white sheep and doing a terrible job of it. So I see all of these things with Joyce. How obsessive am I about Joyce? Well, I've had a bucket list all my life about wanting to go to Trieste and Pula. I finally went a year ago. And if you're into Joyce, it's just wonderful being in those cities because particularly Pula, which is at the southern tip of the Istrian Peninsula, it's gone from being so many different things. When Joyce was there, it was part of Austria, and then it became part of Italy, and then in 1950 or so, they kicked out all the Italians, and it became part of Yugoslavia, and then around 1990, it became Croatia. So Joyce lasted 6 months in Pula. He taught English at the Berlick School, which is now a hotel, a hostel called the James Joyce Hostel. And that's where he taught. It's a beautiful building. And you can walk around Pula and it looks the same as when he was there. And really get a sense of what was going on in this young man's life. And then, of course, 15 or so years in Trieste, and he, I think some of his greatest books were written there. And I'm sure others will talk about that. So, yeah, I still think about him. I'm still indebted to him. I think certain Irish writers can't get out from under his shadow, which is difficult. Certainly Beckett managed it very well. And there's quite a few others. And yeah, so, I don't want to hog up, but I'll start by saying that and shut up.
Great. Well, one of the things that, and maybe we can have Emer jump in now, because I've been thinking a lot about Joyce's portrayal of women and genders, and of course Ulysses owes its existence. I've seen some critics say that because it was inspired by his wife Nora, funded by Harriet Shaw Weaver of Shakespeare and Company, of course, and serialized by Margaret Anderson and Jane Heap, the editors of A Little Review, and then published by Sylvia Beach. And so in a very kind of deep and profound way, his reception depended upon women. And yet I feel like in the time since Ulysses, perhaps there's been a little feminist reappraisal of Joyce in some ways. I'm curious, Emer, as an Irish writer, what do you make of Joyce, and what effect has he had on your work?
Well, I think to speak about what Michael spoke is that he was the shadow. It would be like trying to be a painter in the 60s with Picasso looming over you, and they almost had to invent abstract expressionists to get away from Picasso. So he always was the shadow. He was the but if you had to be in anybody's shadow, that's a pretty good, that tall thin shadow with the boating hat. That's a pretty good shadow to be in. I think for me, he was the mountain. That was daunting, but when I was 17, I left Ireland, and I remember packing my parents. They had a copy of Ulysses, and I brought it with me, full of ambition at 17, and opened it up and was like, my mind exploded. I forced my way. It was like trudging thigh high through a vat of peanut butter going, I can't. But that was the joy of it. It was really hard, but that was okay. If you accept that everything won't be revealed to you, there was a certain freedom, and I certainly use that all through my writing, of the idea of it doesn't always have to make sense immediately. It doesn't have to make sense at all. And Joyce had his own sense of everything. I'm sure every word he knew, every sentence, but he was there. I think he said once, they said, what are you doing, when he was writing Finnegan's Wake? And he said, I'm trying to confound the critics for the next 300 years. And I think he must do that, right? Because I think in all great art, there is mystery, right? It's almost the key to great art. When everything is revealed quickly, then it's just not good. It's too easy, and it doesn't last. But with Joyce, that layer on layer on layer. I mean, he was the ultimate modernist, mysterious writer, because everybody has their own interpretation. Everybody has their own way in, and nobody even knows what they mean. So it gives those layers are, I think, what keeps him alive, which is very good to know as a writer. You don't always have to explain yourself, and that you can go a little mad on the page. I think he really did go a little mad on the page, you know. Mm-hmm. And the women thing, I think people, you know, he was, and they can go of his day. He was pretty. He had misogynistic ideas about women and their understanding of literature. Yet it was women who made James Joyce, like Harriet Weaver. I think in today's calculation gave him $250,000 or $500,000. There was the great story of when she was giving him money, and she was very frugal herself. But she came to visit him, and he was there. She took the bus, he took a taxi, and they were in the restaurant. They were in the restaurant, and he was tipping lavishly, and she was almost horrified. He's like, he was a great tipper, which I always like about James Joyce. Mm-hmm. That he was there tipping lavishly on her money. You know, I kind of like that story. But and he would not have been published if it wasn't for Sylvia Beach. In ways like when we're talking now of trying to get published and self-publishing, Joyce was really, Ulysses was self-published by his friends upstairs in Shakespeare and Company. So, you know, it wasn't a given that it would be the big success it was. But women certainly did protect him and nurture his talent. And in the end, I think Molly Bloom is one of the greatest female characters. Like, she is all woman, right? She is all 3D. She is complex. She's sexual. She's not afraid of herself. She's a great female character, you know. Nobody, you know, he might have had that surface misogynistic, but he was married to Nora, and Molly Bloom was such a great character. I could say deep down he knew women. I could say that.
Mm-hmm. I wonder if we can talk about the trajectory from accessibility on some level in Dubliners and the trajectory toward obscurity with Finnegan's Wake. Looking at Michael's essay in Green Dreams, I'm reminded of how opaque, really, Dubliners appeared to a teenage reader, even to an undergraduate in college. It was tough work to visualize and experience those stories as richly as one might. And those are the easy ones. So how about that idea of confounding the critics? Is he confounding the critics 300 years out, or is he losing an audience? Does he still have an audience that actually reads the work?
He's extra literary, which very few writers are. In our contemporary world, I'll give you two examples. The word quark in physics comes from Finnegan's Wake. The word Google, that hateful company in California, comes from James Joyce. He's very relevant today. There's still a lot of words in Finnegan's Wake to mine in terms of new inventions and how to describe them. So I think he's very important in that sense. As linearity breaks down, something like Finnegan's Wake becomes much more important. And as we become more polyglot, it becomes more important. As we become, even in our own households, more multicultural, it becomes more important. So the language that he's using in Finnegan's Wake, 100 years from now may be more relevant than the language we're speaking right now in this podcast. I think if any of his books are going to last, it's Finnegan's Wake, and it's not a linear work, so it's performative. It's something oral. The only way I've ever understood that book is when I used to drink, being dead drunk and reading it aloud with my friends, and it was delightful, and it made perfect sense when you were stoned out of your mind. So he had that element as well. Yeah, I I know not that many people have actually read all of Finnegan's work, but I know quite a few people who like it. He's a big influence also on language poets, which were more known to us in the 80s and 90s. But people like Charles Bernstein are still very big figures in the world of American poetry, and and I would say Gertrude Stein and James Joyce are two of the biggest influences on that movement in poetry.
I think the
Might
question
be a good time to get.
trajectory is related to the question of relevance. Emer, you mentioned the mystery in Joyce, and we spent many the mystery through Dubliners, where in the midst of stories you have at one point in the story you have a separation, and there's something missing, the time period missing, there's information missing, and then the story comes back. And filling in those empty spaces is part of the challenge of reading letters. To the mystery of Joyce continued writing, he added density. So there's probably no more mystery in Finnegan's Wake than there was in Dublin, but it's certainly a lot denser. And in terms of the relevance, it seems to me after 100 years, or after roughly a century, depending on what we're talking about, to still be relevant, the literature has to be great. And I think we could talk a little bit about what makes good literature. We could probably talk some hours on that. But in addition to being good, what makes somebody still relevant, I think, is that the readers make that writer relevant. There may be great writers from Joyce that people have forgotten, simply because there was no continuity in the interest in the writer. Around Joyce, and I think especially regarding the interest in Finnegan's Wake and the challenges that they present, there's almost a cult around Joyce. You probably all saw the list at the end of the 20th century of the most famous novels of the 20th century with best literature. And it was amazing how many commentators talked about Ulysses being a great novel that most people have not read, or people who only read a little bit of. The fact that Finnegan's Wake was even on the list seems startling, because, as you were saying, Michael, most people have not read Finnegan's Wake, even great scholars have not necessarily read all of Finnegan's Wake. And so I think the cult is growing up around Joyce, not just in terms of his reputation, but his tourism, the tourist dollars in Ireland. The fact that there's a foundation in Europe that people flock to, like a kind of mecca for studies, and it's all well deserved. And Fritz does a great job of running and promoting the foundation and workshops in Zurich. I think all of it kind of contributes to a cult where one doesn't actually have to read Joyce anymore. He's kind of in the zeitgeist still. I think one other thing perhaps too that's unique to Joyce is in his early work, when you look at Finnegan's Wake, these books are hard to approach as individuals. They almost encourage communal study. Finnegan's Wake especially seldom do people really read alone. You read it in reading where people are contributing different thoughts, different insights into the passage. And I think this kind of communal reading is something that's I wouldn't say it's unique to literature, but it's really very strong in both things.
I wonder, Dr. Senn, are you able to join us now, Fritz?
You're talking to me?
Yes.
I just have to say, you speak loud enough. I don't understand anything, so I'm sorry I'm out of it. It's just not, I don't understand. I hear you, but I don't know what you're saying, so I can't join.
Yeah, there are some audio issues, I think.
I believe you talked about Finnegan's Wake.
Yes.
Okay. Now, what occurs to me is, I mean, I've given up Finnegan's Wake, by the way. Though I've started long ago, longer than you, of course, I'm older, and I was one of the pioneers, but I give up simply because I don't understand enough, basically. And I'm a philologist. I want to have some kind of understanding. I'm not saying it should be all clear, but there should be something that people can go and write books about something that they probably don't understand much more than I do. That always surprises me. I don't quite get it. I would like no. And if somebody may have said you should read it aloud. It's one of the things that's always said. You did, okay, that's perfectly all right. Only you can only hear from the reading what the reader puts in and notices themselves. What they don't know, it doesn't come out. It's fun to listen to it. And of course, another thing for Finnegan's Wake is it's often funny and we can't tell why it is funny. Often we can do that, but in many ways it is, and it would be quite interesting. I have quite a bit of experience in reading groups, and I have a hard time hearing. You could also almost predict at which passage people begin to giggle and to titter and all of that. You could theoretically have an audit Finnegan's Wake reading that we would be supplied with these things like heart, and then you could measure the heartbeat and the sweat and all of that kind of thing. So it does have a physical impact, and that's quite unique.
That it makes me think of that the physical impact when the trial, of course, that Random House went on to publish Ulysses, and what the judge said, that when he declared the novel was not obscene, that the effect of Ulysses on the reader undoubtedly somewhat emetic, but it is not particularly an aphrodisiac, right? And this idea that it can make him vomit, but it doesn't really have much erotic pleasure, which I think is not true. But it's fascinating to me that this book, there was such resistance to it, and yet it kind of found its way through the underground. And what do you think has shifted about the sensibility now? I mean, it seems like now it'd be hard to imagine a climate in which Joyce was expurgated or censored in any way. I mean, is this an evolution, or what do you make of this?
Well, I have a famous family story that my mother in the 60s was teaching somewhere in Bon Boy, I think in Calvin, and she in a little 2-room school, and her brother in New York had smuggled her a copy of Ulysses, and apparently they didn't know he wasn't banned in Ireland. They just assumed he was banned in Ireland, but nobody bothered banning him because I think they thought no Irish person could even read him. So my mother thought, so it was assumed Ulysses was banned when he wasn't. But my mother was seen reading in the school, and somebody reported it. And the priest came into the school, and he made her throw the book in the fire. And there was a little fire in the classroom, and the kids had to bring turf every day to school to put in the fire to keep the classroom warm. And she was made burn the book. So she always remembered that, and her brother in New York said, I'll bring you another one. But it was the family story of a priest coming in and telling a teacher burn that book. And the other thing he said, he was very disapproving because she was wearing a mini skirt and thigh-high boots teaching in that little classroom in Cavan. So it was scandalous on all sorts of levels. But there was that idea that he was dangerous. Right? Like the Americans said, there was the big court case, and certainly he was viewed as dangerous. In our high school, we never touched on Joyce. Like we went through all of like secondary school in Ireland. We did Shakespeare, we did Tennyson, I mean, we did John Donne. Not one word of Joyce in secondary school. That still stuns me to this day. In a way, and then suddenly there were statues of him around Dublin, and they put him on the money, even though he never had any money in his life. And, you know, his face was on the money, and I was thinking, were we pandering to the tourists? Really, I think it was the Europeans and the Americans who loved Joyce for us and made us accept him. But he certainly was not loved in Ireland until we saw him loved outside, which is very treacherous of us. But he knew we were treacherous. He knew.
It was about the banning of your book that you started with, and John Woolsey's pronouncement, which is quite interesting. The book may be emetic, but it's not aphrodisiac. If you throw up, that's okay. It's not. Now, the trouble with your list is Judge Woolsey was right. As far as I'm concerned, there's nothing erotic in it. I was quite disappointed when I saw it, because I took dirty books around and I tried. And of course, it is singularly unerotic, almost as much as Phoenix Wake. But it has its qualities, of course, and that's why I'm still here.
Emer, in your experience, do you think the work was omitted from secondary school curricula because of its obscenity, its supposed obscenity, or because of its difficulty, its obscurity?
Well, I mean, it strikes me like everybody could read a story from Dubliners. Why was he nowhere? You know, there wasn't a peep. Like Joyce or Beckett were just left out when I was growing up, even though they were the ones most admired. You know, I went to secondary school in the late 80s, so they were very admired abroad, but yet not a word. I think they were disapproved of. I think they were seen as dangerous. As yeah.
There were also legal reasons why it was not read in Ireland, and that is libel laws. Joyce was famous for wanting to settle a lot of scores with people who he felt personally had offended him, and they appear in the book. Oliver St. John Gogarty is Buck Mulligan. He's right there in the beginning, stately, plump Buck Mulligan, and he was deeply offended by what Joyce had to say about him. You know, Joyce basically felt that Mulligan or Gogarty tried to kill him. And there's good evidence that he did try and didn't succeed. So when he left and he lived all those years in Trieste, he had a lot of scores that he wanted to settle. And those people appear in the book. And so in the legal world of Ireland and in the legal world of Great Britain, which Ireland was a part of until 1922, these were issues that could not be ignored by publishers. That if somebody was recognizable in a book and they were being critically evaluated in that book in a way that could overstep a legal boundary. And I think that's one of the main reasons why the book was not allowed to be published in Ireland for so long. And I think Emer really hits it on the head that it was really American Irish that made Joyce's reputation. And even a lot of his people who sponsored him were American Irish people, and then they picked up the slack years later. But she's talking about 1980s, and he's still not in the curriculum. It's astounding, and I have to say, just seeing visually 5 men and 1 woman, this is not the picture of Irish literature anymore. The picture of Irish literature today would be 5 women and 1 man. That the writers of Ireland are Emer, Helena Mulcairn's her good friend. It's Sally Rooney, who's everywhere on the planet. It's poets like Katrina O'Reilly. The list could go on and on. It's a fabulous list. The Irish literature of today is astoundingly rich and diversified, and I think it's one of the best literatures in the world today. And it is female driven. It is not male driven anymore, and it's a very different country than the one that Joyce left in 1904. We have a part Indian gay man who's the head of the country. We have all the rock stars that came out of there. It's just a very astoundingly different place.
Yeah, and just saying about all that, the libellousness, the famously Stephen Joyce, his grandson, was very protective of the work. And I remember when I was teaching in Trinity College, people were saying, don't teach Dubliners because you can't photocopy it. Don't ever photocopy on a Trinity photocopier, Dubliners. This was while he was alive, because he's dangerous. He could sue. It wasn't in common. Now it's in common domain, so anybody can use it. But there was the famous story that he stood up at a conference. A young man stood up and said to Stephen Joyce, who had burned all the letters. Lucia had sent James Joyce all these letters, which apparently were very like in the language of Finnegan's Wake, because they were like, they could speak multiple languages and they spoke them to each other. And he got rid of them because he thought they reflected badly on the family. And a man stood up at a conference in Germany and said, your grandfather did not belong to you. He belonged to the world. You'd no right to do that. And that was W.B. Yeats' son. Told him that at a conference in Germany.
Who also said Stephen is only a grandson.
Yes, Stephen was the grandson, but it was W.B. Yeats' son who said that to him. Yeah. So I think Stephen, even Kate Bush wanted to do something on Ulysses, and he said no, which I'm very disappointed. I hope she does it now. So.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Stephen Joyce had one very good point, an extreme, when he said even reading a book is a breach of copyright. The nature of books is a bit different, yeah. Yeah, and of course he was continued that libel propensity of his grandfather. By the way, you talked about the Mulligan and Gogarty, who was offended. It's in some way understandable, because Gogarty became Mulligan, of course, at a certain point of his life. He lost his individuality and became a character in a book. Nobody likes that. It's a bit humiliating. I think he's quite well portrayed. He's funny and all of that. I mean, he animates the book in many ways. And Joyce had no scruples taking things from him, and the grandson then was so particular about copyright.
Yep.
And didn't I read somewhere that they're trying to repatriate Joyce's remains back to Ireland, right? Because he's not buried in Ireland.
That's right. I think that was kind of a ridiculous note.
Is that
about Stephen being buried?
Yeah.
Like Joyce, they wanted to dig Joyce up and bury him in Dublin, But
Okay.
feeling
Yeah.
even the Irish said, let him rest in Zurich. He got his,
They called me right away, and I said, you have to ask Stephen first, because it's done. And there's no danger of ever doing it, because the grave in Zurich contains other bodies that have nothing to do with Ireland anyway. But
Yeah.
as I said, I'm not mounting the barricades to defend a few bones.
I think Joyce would have liked that. He'd have liked the idea of relics, if we could have relics of him.
Yeah.
My grandmother,
Yeah.
my grandmother used to carry a piece of the True Cross in her purse, so all the writers could carry a little bone of Joyce or something.
Oh,
Well, St. Joyce.
How about Joyce in relation to historical event? I know that he considered World War I an interruption on the publication of Ulysses, and World War II interfered with the publication of Finnegan's Wake. And we're entering a period now where political activism seems to be in the ether. One must encounter in one way or another. Where was Joyce in relation to the historical movements of his time?
well, he wasn't. I think he thought of himself as a kind of leftist and an anarchist, but I don't think he really was. He was a fairly conservative man. I mean, any of his peculiarities, you could almost ascribe all of them to his alcoholism, and that minus the alcoholism, he was a very conventional man. He was, he was not a wild man or anything like that. But he drank pretty heavily, and he would get into events that most drinkers get into. I mean, I feel bad for him that World War I interrupted his career. I mean, just think, what would have happened if there was no World War I? I mean, World War I was so disruptive to all of the modernist writers. It pretty much killed Apollinaire. It just took a little longer for him to get home. And it made Ezra Pound an utter lunatic, a political pariah by the end of World War II. I mean, he was put on trial for treason. Had he lost that trial, he would have been hung or executed in some manner. And yet his life is inextricably joined to Joyce's, because Joyce was a completely obscure figure and probably would have gone for the rest of his life that way in Trieste, except that Ezra Pound discovered him and then brought him to Paris, and then everything changed for Joyce and his family. So that it's an astounding story. I love the modernist. I not just Joyce. I just wrote a novel about Ezra Pound because on the one hand his poetry is so original and influential, and then on the other hand his politics are just reprehensible, utterly and totally reprehensible. So Joyce wasn't that bad. He wasn't anything like Ezra Pound. He wasn't anything like T.S. Eliot. He wasn't. There was a lot of generosity, I thought, to his writing. I think I would disagree with what everyone had said today about Ulysses not being sensual and erotic. I think that Molly Bloom's ending is just a total jism-filled paean to the human body and sex and the oily, smelly nature of it. Yeah, it was just, I mean, I think the first time I encountered it, I was about 15, 16 years old. And I think 15-year-old boys can masturbate to anything. But, you know, I probably masturbated to Molly Bloom a few times. So, and, you know, I'm not sure he would do it at age 74, but there was something there.
And Michael, speaking of Pound, we all know the influence that he had on Eliot's The Wasteland. He was also Joyce's first editor, really. And what do you make of the work that he did? In some ways, he was a censor, right? He took out some of the parts that he thought were a little more objectionable, and it's my understanding he didn't do as good a job with Joyce as he did with Eliot. Do you know how his edits operated?
His edits for Joyce were quite generous and thoughtful. They were for Eliot too. We may not have ever heard of Eliot if it wasn't for Ezra Pound. His editing of The Wasteland is a work of genius. It's the most sensational editing job ever done by anybody. He was really he understood Joyce really well. I don't think he cut him off in any way.
But he wasn't a champion of Finnegan's Wake, right? Wasn't he really critical of where Joyce was going when it was work in progress? And wasn't Pound encouraging him to think of something else, to abandon this project?
Yeah, I think he wanted more Ulysses. Yeah. Yeah, and they eventually went like this. They just didn't really see eye to eye beyond, say, like the mid-20s. And then Pound went off to Italy, and Joyce remained in Paris. And politically, they were very different. In terms of their upbringing, they were very different. Ezra Pound, I've heard it described as an American hick who spoke many languages badly. And so there is that element in all of his writing that he just sounds like a cowboy.
Jim, were you going to say something?
Well, going back to the question about social upheaval in Joyce's day, I mean, Joyce certainly had socialist leanings, but his focus was on literature, and I think it remained focused on literature. And Michael, you were saying, you have the question about the First World War and the introduction, what effect does that have on Joyce's career? I think certainly the reception of Joyce was probably interrupted or certainly affected by the war. But Joyce never stopped working. I mean, Joyce never stopped working and writing under crazy circumstances, writing in his kitchen with dying babies and so forth, until the very end. And I think World War I, the Great War, simply meant that Joyce had to move from Trieste, where he had already had about 18 different dwellings anyway, and he had to move to Zurich. I'm not sure that the war really had much effect on his literary production in terms of his ability to work.
Well, in terms of his family, it had an effect because his brother was in an internment camp for the whole war, and when he finally got out, there was an estrangement between the brothers that it seems like never got mended.
Right, and it was
then Stanislaus
to Trieste too, because it had changed, and that's where his brother stayed.
Yeah.
There was a geographic separation that never got mended either.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, did Stanislaus die in Trieste? I think he may have. I think he's buried there.
Maybe. He did live the rest of his life in Italy.
Okay, so when I was in Pula a year ago, I think Emer will especially appreciate this. They were celebrating Bloomsday on June 6th.
Why?
Exactly. So it tells me that while they love the idea that Joyce began his career in their little town, I don't think they quite understood what Bloomsday was. And that the 16th was the day, and it couldn't be any other day. But if you go to Pula, you can celebrate it on the 6th.
You could have double Bloomsday.
Yes.
Maybe we need a Finnegan. Maybe that's Finnegan's Wake Day. You can have it any day.
Yeah, that's it. Yes.
Where do you think we see his influence today the most? Do you feel him in your own work? I'm thinking of, just what Bloomsday is, right? A man walks across a city. That's its entire action. He's waiting for his wife to consummate an assignation with a paramour. And then there's the literary pyrotechnics that the book seems to move toward more and more and more. Do we see any of these things in writers of today? I'm especially interested, Michael, in what you said about the great number of women writing in Ireland and how that's a kind of predominant faction. How are they feeling, Joyce? What do they say about him? Sally Rooney, for instance, I think she's anti-Yeats. Has she discussed Joyce? And do we see any Joyce in any of these contemporary writers?
Take it, Emer.
Yeah, I think you can't help but see Joyce everywhere, because he has to be either approached or avoided, but he is that shadow. I mean, there is no way around Joyce any more than there was. He's one of the giants, right? And they cast long shadows, whether you like them or not. Like the analogy with Picasso. One of my favorite pieces. It's his play with words. I think that the Irish love to play with words, and part of it is that we are speaking English as an Irish language, like we speak in idioms of Irish. The way we speak English is very different, because we're kind of always translating in our own heads, even if we aren't raised with Irish. We are speaking in Irish English. And there's one part, my favorite part. Could I just read a little bit of Ulysses, where he's falling asleep? And for me, I think, when I read that, realizing he just captures that moment where your mind just drifts and gives up to the unconscious, which was a huge thing in Europe at the time, right, with Freud and the unconscious and dreams. But this is my favorite quote of this, where he's falling asleep and he says, "Womb weary, he rests, has traveled with Sinbad the sailor, and Chinbad the tailor, and Jinbad the jailer, and Whinbad the whaler, and Ninbad the nailer, and Finbad the failer, and Binbad the bailer, and Pinpad the paler, and Minbad the mailer, and Hinbad the hailer, and Rinbad the railer, and Dinbad the caler, and Vinbad the quailer, and Linbad the yailer, and Zinbad the failer. When, going to the dark bed, there was a square round, Sinbad the sailor rocks ox egg, in the night of the bed of all the ox of the rocks of Darkenbad the bright daler." Where? It's ending that intricate chapter on that moment of falling asleep. I think what that does for all writers, and not just Irish writers, is it was kind of, he had the key that unlocked the door, right? And then the door could be kicked off its hinges, and then out we could all gallop into the open and weren't constrained anymore. He was that. He was the key in many ways in the middle there of the century for all of us. Mm-hmm. And there was no coming back. Once the door was open, it was off the hinges. No coming back for any writer in English language to come back from that. Not just for Irish writers, I think for English language writers.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes.
I'm thinking of something that Michael says in the essay in Green Dreams, that Joyce's first and foremost words. And Michael, you isolate those three first words in the opening story of Dubliners and build on that. And Emer, what you just read is all about the words. I'm wondering about the psychology of the characters. How does that factor into an appreciation of Ulysses? I've always balked at the central action being about a man who just is waiting for his wife to fuck somebody else. It just strikes me as amazingly peculiar, yet you buy it. Is the psychology of the characters something that Joyce is wrestling with, or is that something off to the side? Is he more interested in the words?
Well, psychology, if you're talking psychology, Dubliners is it. The psychology in Dubliners is just profound. I don't know who's that talking, but it's great.
Joyce,
I think he said something about getting to the bottom of it. So that's what we're trying to do, isn't it? So I think of psychologically Dubliners. I think it's probably one of the greatest collections of stories. Saying that, it's not my favorite short story book. William Trevor is. And I'm not sure William Trevor is in the same league with Joyce, and yet in terms of the pleasure of reading, I prefer to read William Trevor stories. And there's a vast number of them. I once saw William Trevor on the Strand, waiting to go into a theater that I was going into too. It was an adaptation of Great Expectations. And I went up to him and I said, "Excuse me, are you William Trevor?" And he said, "No, I'm not." And I said, "But I know that you are." And he said, "Well, I'm going to go in here and see this play. Thank you." And then he walked away. He was like a great, when I lived in London for 15 years, and, William Trevor was, he writes about London so well. Joyce doesn't write about London. And he was not a London Irish, the way I was, and the way Yeats was probably, and most other Irish writers. The thing about Joyce that, when we were talking earlier about legacies, and I think one of the things that's very important about Joyce in terms of the European Union and its inception is that Joyce is literally the first Irish person to be a European. He shaped his identity not as an Irishman, but as a European. And his whole reference to literature was Europe. And to me, that's, having lived in Europe that way for 15 years, I take that as the really profound thing about him. Particularly right now with Britain having left the EU, where it will happen at the end of this year. And what a profound thing that's going to have culturally, economically, and every other way. But with Joyce, the European writer, I see Ulysses being important in Europe for many, or maybe long after everybody in Ireland has forgotten about him. In Trieste, they have a basketball team, and it's a professional basketball team. And on the jersey of the Trieste basketball team, it says La mia anima, Trieste. So my heart, my spirit is in Trieste. Now, who said that? It's on the basketball uniform. James Joyce said that to Nora. So that's important. I mean, that the idea that a European basketball team would have a quote from James Joyce on their uniforms is significant. It shows you that he's a European writer. So I don't know if the Irish are ever going to put him on a rugby shirt, something like "Fuck Ireland" or something. But anyhow, it's.
There's also, Michael, the idea of the family. Like there's books. What other literary family? There's books written about Nora. There's a film on Nora Barnacle. There's Dance in the Wake, a great book written on Lucia Joyce. People have made films on Lucia Joyce. They were kind of the holy family of Ireland. They were so strange. They were so out there. It was so, in a time when everybody had 11 kids and living in hovels or whatever we were doing then, here they were wandering penniless across Europe, but sitting in cafes and being dancers and being singers. And this whole idea of the Joyce family. There's really no other literary family that we're so connected with. The grandson, they're very much alive in our heads. Maybe Yeats in some ways, but that was way more conventional than what the Joyces were doing, because they were, almost drifting across Europe, relying on other people for money. It was the ultimate kind of bohemian experience, yet he was a very, as you said, conventional man, but leading a very bohemian life. Almost relying on other people. The art was everything, And Lucia the dancer, and all of that mythology that's grown up around them, that the Joyce family are very much alive. We could have our own little manger instead of Jesus and Mary. We put James and Nora in our own little manger.
On Bloomsday.
So as we come up past the hour mark, this is the New York Writers Workshop. I'm Ravi Shankar. This is Tim Tomlinson. We're joined by Fritz Senn, Michael Gregory Stevens, Jim LeBlanc, and Emer Martin. And happy Bloomsday to everyone, having this kind of fascinating conversation. And Michael, I mean, when you were talking about him being the first European, I think in some ways he's also one of the first global citizens, right? I think in Stephen Dablis, when Steve, you talk to me of nationality, language, and religion, I shall try to fly by those nets, right, is what he says. And so there's a way in which he's always kind of been very cosmopolitan and global. Does anyone here know what Joyce's influence is around the world? I mean, is there a huge global studies of Joyce happening?
I think Jim or Fritz might know.
Yeah.
I think he has trouble hearing.
There's quite a bit of Joyce scholarship now being done in South Asia. Many of the young Joyceans are in South Asia. She's also in Japan, if you understand me.
So you're talking like Vietnam or someplace like that?
I don't know about Vietnam. I'm thinking of South Asia in terms of India and Pakistan, that area.
Okay.
There's a wonderful image in the Ellman biography of Joyce after the publication of Ulysses, and he's drunk and he's running down the street with the book in his hand, and he's just shouting to the world, "I made them take it. I made them take it." And that always strikes me. So every time I publish a book, I always make sure to get drunk and run around and going, "I made them take it. I made them take it." So it's kind of like, yeah, he made us take it. He made us take it. It was implausible and preposterous that Ulysses. Could you imagine trying to get Ulysses published now? it would be almost as impossible as it was then. You know?
Lucy Ellman, whom I believe is Richard Ellman's granddaughter, has a book out maybe 3 or 4 years ago called Duck's Newberry Crab. I don't know if you all are familiar with it. It's basically 1,000 pages, maybe 4 sentences. It is.
Oh, yeah.
It's complete stream of consciousness in the mind of one woman with vignettes having to do with small vignettes that interrupt her stream of consciousness.
And who is that, you said?
Lucy Ellman.
Okay.
Okay. I have here these. I grabbed them. These. There's 2 kids books. These are children's books from the stories of Finnegan's Wake, illustrated by Thomas McNally. The Mooks and the Groups, and then there's the Aunt and the Gracehopper. So, and they're beautifully illustrated, and they have just bits of Finnegan's Wake. And I think, like Michael said, look at these, with parts of just stories from Finnegan's Wake. I think. I think the future might belong to Finnegan's Wake in some ways. In some ways, something will happen, like those multi-languages, or, it might not be able to be approached as a full book, but certainly parts of it will still always be there. Maybe the book didn't suit the book in a way.
Yeah. And Jim, I know I saw this fascinating diagram that you had about encountering Finnegan's Wake, and it kind of moved from provection in one direction and divection and crossing the threshold of plausibility. I mean, what is your kind of approach towards that text?
The diagram you refer to, I actually got that originated with Fritz about prolexis. Prolexis being a way to describe Joyce's over-the-topness, or just going too far with things. And I used it in the diagram referring to talk about reading Finnegan's Wake. And there's a threshold at which things become implausible. You can all agree perhaps on the meaning of one word or one phrase, and people kind of nod and say, yes, that's what we think it means. You can also do a reading of a short passage or a word which is completely over the top. And Joyce's language kind of encourages this. You start doing things that are anachronistic, readings that are actually impossible, so implausible. But where I think the payoff is, and where the real enjoyment is in reading Finnegan's Wake, is that area which is neither completely clear nor completely obscure or obtuse, where what you are reading is plausible enough to make you feel like you're understanding the text, you're absorbing the text in a way that is kind of acceptable. And I've referred to that as the threshold of plausibility, where the collective, the idea of getting further and further beyond the scale, it's still within one's scale. I think one of the things about Finnegan's Wake is it really makes you think about what reading is. My first experience with reading Finnegan's Wake was in a reading group. And I was in graduate school, and a friend of mine in the English department invited me to join a summer reading group for Finnegan's Wake. The plan was to read all 626 pages during the summer, with assignments of about 50, 60 pages a week. And I had seen Finnegan's Wake, and I said to him, it's unreadable. I mean, it's just gibberish. And he said, no. We have the people in the group have had some experience, give you something to hold on to. And he says, you could bring wine and beer and snacks and potato chips and so forth. And I thought, okay, I can do that. I can go and drink wine and eat chips and talk about this book. About 2/3 of the way through, after reading 400 pages, understanding virtually nothing, I was reading Finnegan's Wake one night, and I realized I was reading it. Not in the sense that you're reading a normal text, but I was starting to make connections with things sound familiar to me and so forth. And I realized that what I was reading, the way I was reading was not normal reading, but it was useful reading. And I think that's what happens with Finnegan's Wake if you give it enough time. You start thinking about what it is to read, what it is to deal with ambiguity and the unknown, and difficulties in language, and nuances in words, and shifts in point of view that we actually could apply to our daily lives, when we see everything as kind of transparent. We deal with information as transparent. But if we stop to think about it, it isn't so transparent. And Finnegan's Wake, you have to think about it. You have to think about what it means to read and what it means to interpret. But that was a very long answer to the question.
Now that gives me hope, although I don't know if I'm going to take up the the offer. I remember having Finnegan's Wake on bookshelves for decades. And one day I said to myself, you know what? It's never going to happen. I got rid of it and I felt so much easier. I love hearing, however, these explications and these ways of entering into it, especially thinking of it as something for the future, that it will be uncoded and people might be more interested in it the more we become globalized and the world shrinks and linearity finally leaves us. I think I'm reading in an earlier century.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Someone has asked if anyone can comment on the influence of Tolstoy on Joyce. I don't know if there is any direct influence, but maybe just to broaden the question, who did he understand as his literary forebears? Who was he responding to? Who was he working against?
Flaubert, for one.
Ibsen, he adored Ibsen.
Yes.
Yeah. And Dante.
Mm-hmm.
Dante was his hero. And Shakespeare to some degree. I mean, in Ulysses, they do argue about Hamlet a little bit.
He certainly had a strong command of Shakespeare.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Joyce was extremely well read, and despite having very clear eyes, he always managed to figure out a way to absorb books. Later in life, people read to him, like Beckett. Wouldn't you like to have been a fly on the wall for that reading?
Mm-hmm.
But
not only well read, but a great memory. He would remember in great detail what he read for years and years and years.
Yeah, and incredible memory. Yeah, like great actors have that too.
Joyce was very well read, you said.
Yeah.
That's up to a point. From the 20s on, I don't think he read anything. Nobody ever caught Joyce with a book in Paris. He looked at newspapers and things like that, but he didn't. I was quite surprised when he had a parody in A Letter of the Waste Land. So you see, he must have read that. But otherwise, he wasn't interested in any writer of importance. Mm-hmm. And Finnegan's Wake came out of little things like that. So Joyce was reading a great deal. As a young man up to, I don't know when, but afterwards, there's nothing of any interest. He read railway guides and things like that. That's what Finnegan's Wake is made up. So one has to be a bit careful about these generalizations.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I could be disproved. If anyone shows a letter where Joyce said, or Kafka, or Thomas Mann, or anyone of importance, I don't think you can come up with something.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think Fritz.
Well,
the point that he was, what Michael was saying, that he was very well read, but yeah, people can stop reading. And I think he was very competitive, and apparently he would sit around at cafes bemoaning the fact that Kafka was all the rage in Europe, and he felt very competitive. So a lot of writers can be paralyzed out of competitiveness.
I wonder if he said it. He said anything about Virginia Woolf, of course, who found him utterly boring. And what did she say? The work of a queasy undergraduate scratching his pimples, very famously, right? Did Joyce have any opinion of Woolf, I wonder?
It was dim. The estimate was dim. The writer he really liked was James Stephens, and he famously said that if he died before Finnegan's Wake was completed, he wanted James Stephens to complete the work for him. I'm not saying that because I'm a relative of James Stephens either. But,
He especially liked Stevens when he found out that they had birthdays on the same day, same year.
yeah, they're born on the same day, same year, February 2nd, 1882. Yeah. I was once in Dublin and in the National Gallery, Portrait Gallery, and there was a big painting of James Stephens, and my partner wanted to take a picture of me standing next to it, and the guard said, "No, you can't do that." And then and she said, "But look at he's Michael Stephens. You've got to let him do this." And then he went, "Well, okay, I'll walk the other way, and you take the picture when I'm not looking," which I think is a way of describing Joyce and Irish culture. Irish people love to break rules. So, you know, like I can recall once getting on a bus at the airport to go into Dublin, and I had no money on me. And then the driver just goes, go on now. And that would never happen in London, by the way. It would never happen. You would get your ass kicked off that bus if you didn't have a freedom pass or some money or something to get on that bus. And they might call a policeman too. And you know, breaking rules, that's an Irish thing. And Joyce liked to break rules. His hero was Ibsen. I think he admired Ibsen throughout his whole life. And Ibsen, Fritz famously also liked to read newspapers. And he would get most of his ideas for his later plays by reading newspapers. So there's much to be said about that connection with Ibsen. Of course, his play, Joyce's one really well-done play, is very Ibsen-esque in its execution. I've seen a really good version of that play done. It's actually a very stageable play if you approach it the right way. So yeah, I would say James Stephens, Ibsen were influences. I don't think he read Pound. I think he did read Eliot. I think he read Yeats to a certain degree. He made fun of him a lot.
Well, I think he made fun of them in the way that he was, Yeats and Lady Gregory and the Celtic revival, and going back to sort of creating the idea of a Celtic Irish was all that Yeats was trying to reject, and saying, look to Europe, look to Europe, look to Europe, and the intellectual life in Europe, and not look to the past in Ireland, and all of that, trying to break away, as we said, those nets, break through those nets of nationalities. So that was his Europeanness.
Now, in terms of his influence too, I've had correspondence with Roddy Doyle, and he goes in and out of either detesting Joyce or admitting that he's a big influence on him. So there's a very well-known Irish writer, who has a great ambivalence about Joyce. And I can recall, I'm not going to say the person's name, but a well-known American writer was once at dinner in my apartment when I lived in New York on 110th Street. And he went into this tirade about how bad Joyce was and how he hated James Joyce. And he just did that at the wrong person's house, because I kicked his ass out. You know, I mean, I said that was heresy, and I wasn't going to have that in my household. So he got booted out, never invited back ever again. So
Okay, I'll be
Let's-
careful,
there-
Michael. If I'm ever invited around, I'll be very careful.
yeah. Well, I don't have that big old apartment anymore, so yeah.
And didn't Roddy Doyle create some controversy by suggesting Ulysses should be cut by a third or something? I remember some years back.
Yeah, he does say things like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which
And
third
yeah,
would that
related
be?
to Joyce. Related to Joyce, there's in the commitments, there's that section where is his name Jimmy Rabbit or some name like that, the main character. He says to the group when they question an Irish group doing soul music, he gives this whole explanation that the Irish are the blacks of Europe, and the Dubliners are the blacks of Ireland, and the North Dubliners are the blacks of Dublin. So say it once and say it loud. I'm black and I'm proud. That's from the commitments, and you know, I see that little passage from the commitments and the Joyce stuff we were talking about, his being European as being connected in some way. I still love the commitments. I still watch it once in a while.
Mhm.
It's one of the great musical films.
Would they ever manage to film Ulysses?
Yeah, they have, but it's not very good.
Yeah, it's not very good. Yeah. I wonder would they go at it again?
All they have is the plot.
Yeah.
And as Tim pointed out, the plot is really not much.
It doesn't have a plot to piss in.
Yeah, exactly.
I think I was an undergraduate when I saw that movie, and I was making Super 8 films as an undergraduate, and I thought I wish they had given it to me. I could do a much better job. It was just too strictly text bound. It had none of the energy in film that the book had on the page. So it was really too slavishly devoted to the source rather than to imagination. Well, we're coming up on time, and I wonder if, Ravi, have you constructed a really good final question for our panel, and we can walk around the group and have everybody sign off? I think we're getting an answer.
Sorry, I was on mute. Sorry about that. My microphone was on mute. I said, well, I thought I came up with the introductory question, Tim. Well, I think I think it would be great to leave it a little open and go around to each of you. And on this Bloomsday, I mean, what is it that you would like us to carry away? And maybe you could also just say something about your own current projects. I mean, what are you working on now? It doesn't have to be related to Joyce, of course. Where can we find you online? And then just, yes, the little fortune cookie at the end of a great meal. So somebody want to jump in?
I'll end with a little poem.
Great.
The reverb will probably destroy the poem, so you'd have to know Yeats is among school children to get this poem, but I'm presuming probably everybody here has some sense of that poem. Regarding the rain in Pula, I was a 73-year-old public being, which reminded me of old Yeats, only he was as famous as a poet could be, and I was swimming in a sea of obscurity. But there I was in that classroom of pre-teens, girls and boys both, and their lovely teacher who had invited us to speak to them in English about our writing lives. There was no leader there, only these earnest students, hungry to learn a new language, the educator standing by, guiding them along in our talk. Two young girls recited a poem. Their school guide smiled Mona Lisa-like that day in Pula, and at the southern end of the Istrian Peninsula. And there we all were in Dante Square, not far from where James Joyce first taught English at the Burlitt School, only steps away. You could almost see him offering the teacher wild flowers.
It's lovely.
Great, thank you, Michael. Jim, you want to go next?
Well, I don't know if I have a closing statement. I think Bloomsday is a wonderful tradition, celebrating a holiday based on a fictitious day. I guess that's all I have to say.
Thank you, Jim. Emer?
Yeah, I'm going to, well, my project, The Cruelty Men came out at 2019, and I'm currently writing another book that comes from The Cruelty Men, but will stand alone, but it's kind of the next generation on. But I'm going to read the last lines of Ulysses because they're just so beautiful. I was a flower of the mountain, yes, when I put the rose in my hair like the Andalusian girls used. Or shall I wear a red? Yes. And how he kissed me under the Moorish wall. And I thought, well, as him as another. Then he asked me, would I? Yes. To say yes, my mountain flower. And first I put my arms around him, yes. And drew him down to me so he could feel my breasts, all perfume, yes. And his heart was going like mad, and yes. I said, yes, I will, yes. So yes is the last word. I love that it's yes. I love that Joyce was saying yes. It's kind of the last word, and it's really important.
Yes.
In a world that keeps saying just say no, he's the opposite of Nancy Reagan. Just say no. Just say yes. Just say yes.
Michael, did that act as any kind of Viagra for you?
Yes, it did.
Yes. Fritz, can you hear us?
Right now, yes.
Oh, perfect. Do you want to offer any thoughts in conclusion on this day?
No, not again. Sorry to have been of no use.
Okay. Well, this has been a really fun, enlightening, entertaining, educational discussion. I want to thank all of you guys for coming in from as far away as Switzerland and California and Chicago and upstate New York. Ravi coming in, I think, live from Providence, Rhode Island, and I'm in the bowels of Brooklyn, where at least it's quiet. We will be back with regular programming. I hope everyone listening, and I hope all the panel continues to check in on the work of New York Writers Workshop. I used to say that our motto was coming soon to a continent near you. Now we'll be Zooming. So please do check us out. Thank you so much. Happy Bloomsday to everyone.
Happy Bloomsday.
Take care, everyone. Thank you again. Been a pleasure.
Thank you.
So long.
Bye-bye.
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 Bye. Thank you, Tim.
You're very welcome, Emer. Great to meet you. You're a great pleasure.
Thank you. You too.